I would like to welcome you all to this session today. We are celebrating, commemorating the International Anti-Corruption Day 2014. And with increasing awareness about the negative effects of corruption, many people like us are reflecting in a day like today about innovative ways in which we can actually address the problem of corruption. And our objective today is to discuss the negative effects of corruption on development and tax avoidance, and to share some of the thinking, the current thinking and ideas about how to address these problems, what we are doing, what works, what doesn't work, and what we can do best. And for that we have a panel of distinguished experts and representatives from different organizations with different backgrounds, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting discussion, and I really hope that you will engage in the discussion actively as well. And we would like to reflect on a few critical questions. The first is, how does corruption and tax avoidance affect development and democracy? What can we do to break the corruption chain, and what works? And finally, are we doing enough? Are our governments, politicians willing to do what it takes to address the problem of corruption and tax avoidance? How can specific groups like the youth actually contribute to address these problems? And I would like to invite our panelists to join me here at the podium, and I will introduce them to you, and also we will have some commentator from the audience. And I would actually like to start asking Mona. We have seen this video, which has very important information regarding tax avoidance and the negative effects of tax avoidance. Where are the different actors involved in this industry of tax avoidance? So how can we break actually the chain of tax avoidance? How can we address this problem? What is the role of information transparency? Based on your experience in Publish What You Pay, what are we doing about this problem? What are different actors doing? And what is the role of organizations like yours regarding this issue?
Very good questions. I don't know if I can manage to answer them all in 8 minutes. What we are working on in Publish What You Pay Norway is primarily to contribute with knowledge production and strategic policy formulation, and political advocacy work for transparency reforms in extractive industry. The purpose is, of course, to get to a point where we have a financial transparency level that is purposeful, so that resource-rich countries where many citizens are still poor can benefit from rather large revenue streams which can be invested in development. We know that the extractive industry, oil, gas, and mining, is one of the most secretive businesses. It's one of the most powerful industries with one of the biggest lobby forces in the whole world. And we know also the data from conflict research, research on that revenue streams has not translated into common good for citizens. So what went wrong? And we also know that, for example, in export oil and minerals, only 2010 figures was on $333 billion. And it's 7 times the value of international aid, which was $48 billion. So that's 7 times the value of international aid. And when you, in addition, and on top of that, you introduce calculations carried out by institutions such as Global Financial Integrity, and figures from World Bank, you show that the estimated illicit financial flows from developed countries are about 10 times the amount of given in official development assistance. Obviously, that raises the question on which revenue streams are the largest one. And when you, on top of that, take into consideration that over 60% of the illegal capital flight is going through so-called commercial and multinational companies, and over 50% of that again has to do with transfer pricing. That is an enormous sum of the world's capital hidden from public view. It's hidden from public view from tax administrations, from regular citizens, from investors who invest the money in their corporations, and from regular citizens. So for development countries, that is a huge problem, because many of today's countries and places in countries have made it their business to sell a form of secrecy, which basically sells products for other countries' companies in order to conceal information from their own country authorities. And the result is obviously that it contributes to keeping large capital flows away from being invested into the transparent markets, which we all need in order to generate capital for development. So in one of our reports, when we looked at the capital in the extractive industry, we found that 10 of the largest companies in the world, oil, gas and mining, they used 6,000 subsidiaries in order to structure themselves. That was only what we found using already existing information in stock exchanges, which is only the top of the iceberg. And of these, 1/3 was going through tax havens. So I think that says something about the amount of capital kept away. So when we're talking about financing for development, which is very important, I think that there will not be any aid or any country willing to give aid which will amount to such level of financing for development. I think countries are getting less and less eager to mobilize financing for development, because countries should mobilize their own capital. The question is, why don't they, when there is so much money in the system? And transparency information can help break this corruption chain. Various mechanisms can produce different types of information that can give different indications on where the money ends up. So we are working concretely on transparency mechanisms to break the corruption chain.
So let me turn now to grow, and we have heard from Mona regarding the negative effects of tax avoidance and the volume of illicit financial flows, and what are the negative consequences for development financing. And when we look at the issue of corruption and anti-corruption, I think there is an increasing recognition and acknowledgement of the negative effects that corruption has on women. So could you elaborate a little bit on these negative effects and how it's important to have this gender perspective also when we talk about corruption and anti-corruption?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think the issue of the gendered effect of corruption and looking at corruption through gendered lens is very interesting. It's also an area where there to a certain amount have been made assumptions because we lack data.
There's an influential study of 150 countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, done by the World Bank, that, for example, came to the conclusion that women are more trustworthy and less prone to corruption. And these findings are later corroborated by additional research by the World Bank. A good friend of mine in New York, who's a researcher, Anne-Marie Gutz, has questioned this and says that this idea fails to account for the ways in which gender relations may limit women's opportunities to engage in corruption. particularly when corruption functions through all-male networks and forums from which women are excluded. So I think the picture needs balancing. There's also, when I was looking and preparing for being here this morning, I also came across a new study by two political scientists from Rice University who say that it's highly dependent on the institutional context, which is very true, because in a political culture where corruption is stigmatized, women will be less tolerant of corruption and less likely to engage in it compared to men. But if corrupt behaviors are an ordinary part of governance supported by political institutions, there will be no corruption gender gap. Now that's one side of it. On the other side, if men are corrupt as politicians and women are corrupt, the reactions from society are totally different. Because if men are corrupt, voters will usually say that, well, I expected that. If women are corrupt, they will say, oh, I thought she was better than that. So we react differently. That being said, there's also research finding that there's little difference in corruption tolerance between men and women for countries that rank lowest on the polity scale, which is a popular measure of the level of democracy. But in more democratic countries, men are considerably more tolerant of corruption than women. That being said, just to balance out the picture, there is information and data telling us today that women are, as of now, less corrupt than men. And it's, among others, the Transparency International Global Corruption Barometer, which comes out annually and which documents this year after year. But what we see is that women, as of today, are victims of corruption much more than men, because they are still a vulnerable group with less access to information, with less access to financial institutions, and to being economically independent. So because of that, and also because they're the caretakers in many cases, they're the caretakers of children, of the elderly, and they're much more dependent on public services, which then again means that they more often become victims of bribes. There's a study being done, and I thought it would be interesting just to show an example, that says in Bangalore in India, it is indicated that 1 out of 2 women in maternity hospitals had to pay extra money for a physician to be present at birth. And then after childbirth, the research also found that they had to, 70% of these women had to pay to see their babies. And this is something that is very much gendered. It also has influence on other health services. And then there's a bribery that is predominantly gendered, where women are the victims, and that is sexual bribery, which happens where women, for example in school, where studies show that a staggering number of girls in certain countries are being pressured by their teachers for sexual favors to either stay in school or to get their grades. And this also influences on girls being more prone than boys to leave school because they're being pressured. So as of today, there's a number of effects. I also think, just to wrap this up, that we see differences in countries that are more and less democratic, because in more democratic countries you will have more women in parliaments. And that will influence, to a certain extent, the level of corruption. because more women are there to also be the watchdogs. In countries where there's less women in government, women will also have less influence, and corruption will flourish more.
So we have been like moving from the right to the left on the table and discussing different aspects of the negative effects of corruption. And I would like to invite Jan Seth. Based on UNDP's work and experience, which I think it's been really great in communicating very clearly what are the negative effects of corruption on democracy and governance, what would be the reflection and the main messages about these negative consequences?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, friends and colleagues. Let me just say that the global 2014 theme for International Anti-Corruption Day, as you can see, is Break the Corruption Chain. And those of us working on anti-corruption know that this is much easier said than done. But if we were to assume that there is literally a corruption chain that we needed to break, conventional wisdom would dictate that one should therefore focus on the weakest link in that chain. One that isn't rigid and unbending, one that is malleable and accommodating. And here I would refer to, in particular, children and youth, who can instinctively relate to the injustices of corruption and who we need amongst our strongest allies. I'll divert from my speech a little bit, and I want to share with you an anecdote from one of our senior advisors, Lucio, who is working in UNDP in the field of anti-corruption and rule of law in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Last month, Lucio spent some time visiting schools in Kyrgyzstan and talking to children from the ages of 5 to 17. And one of the topics he spoke about was on corruption and the damages it does to society. He asked a group of students how they would feel if a classmate was paying the teacher to get higher grades. Almost everybody rose their hands to say that this wouldn't be right. Some added that if this was the case, they would stop obeying the teacher. Others added that the bad student would soon become ignorant and eventually fail because you cannot buy all the teachers, and sooner or later you'll be caught and kicked out of school. He then asked how they would prevent this from happening. Many answered that the most important thing is to have good teachers, to pay them well, and to be sure homework and grades are accessible to other peers. Others added that students need to understand that you don't study to get good grades, but to learn. In other words, he got some of the most advanced theories on corruption. Lucio then asked a surprising question. What would you do with $121, or the equivalent in Kyrgyz currency? Teachers seemed more surprised than the children by this question. In most of the classes, a real battle ensued in terms of giving these responses. And this is how some of the kids responded in what they would do with this money. I would buy a bike for myself and a doll for my sister, one said. I would buy a television for my grandmother, who gets a pension of only $20 per month. I would buy a sofa for myself so I don't have to squeeze with my brother. I would buy toys for the kids of my neighbor. I'd invite my parents for dinner and pay the bill. I would give them to charity to an old lady who I see down the street every day. I would put them in a bank and get them when I'm 18. I would be rich by then. Once Lucio managed to calm down the storm of proposals, he explained the point he wanted to finally make. According to a study done by the Ministry of Economy, corruption cost to the Kyrgyz citizens the staggering amount of $700 million per year, or 40% of the money the state collects from taxes. Divided by the population, this makes exactly $121 each, which is the figure Lucio started with. So corruption, he says, doesn't make you smarter or richer in the long run. Actually, it makes you poorer. It destroys a society and creates a game where only losers and some temporary winners or better cheaters. Upon leaving the school, a 9-year-old boy approached Lucio, saying that he would tell the story to his grandmother, but he was hoping that she will not get upset once she finds out that somebody had stolen her money she would otherwise have to buy her TV. While grossly oversimplified, I think the story illustrates the impact of corruption through the diversion of financial resources. But corruption is also corrosive of societies and contributes to a justified lack of trust and confidence in governance. The worst consequences of corruption are borne by poor and vulnerable groups, as we've heard. And bribes, for example, can make basic services available to only those who can afford to pay. As the poor are more reliant on public services, they are also disproportionately harmed by what may be, in financial terms, small-time corruption. And research suggests, and as Gro has pointed out in her remarks, that women are the most affected by corruption. And she cited a number of studies. I'll cite one more, where UNDP last year with the Huairou Commission in New York did a study specifically looking at the impacts of corruption on grassroots women. And here's where we saw that from the woman's perspective, of course, corruption entails a wider array of things than what we know as just, for instance, it goes beyond the standard definitions of corruption, whereby you add in the mix physical abuse, sexual favors, which makes it much more complicated and has a very gendered dimension to that form of corruption. The poor also have most to lose from rapid degradation of natural resources stemming from corruption, which enables laws and regulations to be circumvented. Illegal logging, for instance, to which corrupt officials turn a blind eye, can threaten ecosystems on which the poor depend for livelihoods and lead to revenue losses for governments as well. UNDP, through its work in support of the reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, also known as REDD+, is helping to reduce the risk of corruption in forest management. And here Norway is a key partner in this global initiative. UNDP has been working on anti-corruption now for over 2 decades, and in that time we've accumulated quite a vast array of experiences. What we have learned, and this isn't, when you look at it, it's quite sensible, integrated approaches which encompass capacity development, governance reforms, targeting anti-corruption measures, greater access to justice, tracking illicit financial flows, tax evasion, more transparency and greater participation, have all proven to work better in concert than in isolation. Anti-corruption work has also been one of the fastest growing areas in terms of demand for UNDP services in the arena of governance. In part, this is because of the almost widespread ratification of the UN Convention on Anti-Corruption, or UNCAC, which as of last month had 173 parties. And so governments, donors, and development community have realized that unless corruption bottlenecks are removed, inclusive and sustainable development will be delayed, if not derailed. Again, in 2013, for instance, we had 82 of our field offices, so almost half of all of UNDP's offices in the field, reported results and progress in the arena of anti-corruption across the public sectors, strengthening transparent, accountable service delivery, and oversight capacity of civil society and others. We also practice what we preach. We're quite proud of the achievement we had a couple of months ago. UNDP ranked in the Transparency Index, aid transparency index, as the top among 68 multilateral organizations in terms of being transparent with its own information and data. So if you go to a UNDP website, you can find information quite freely on the projects on the ground, contracts, and at the national and subnational level. One final point I want to make before closing, and that is another fast-moving and dynamic trend we are seeing is, and we need to understand better, is the citizen action and mobilization via the ICT, which is really transforming the field of transparency and accountability. And in so doing, it is doing so partly by bridging the gap between individual knowledge, public outrage, and individual sanction. Individuals can report abuse to the masses through varied media channels with unparalleled ease, low or no cost and speed. So from the use of cell phones to social media and transparency portals, ICT has been proven to be an effective tool in the battle against corruption, cutting out the needless transactions, thereby reducing risk and opportunity for corruption. Technology makes it easier to fight corruption as it leaves footprints and trails for us to detect and follow. Because of the citizen action, anti-corruption laws in many countries have improved. There are now many domestic laws aimed at enforcing asset declaration and disclosure by those holding senior public offices. Finally, just as I'm clearly out of time, let me end by quoting the UN Secretary General, from the UN Secretary General's message on this occasion. And I quote, "Next year the world will agree on a new post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. Our aim is to empower individuals and catalyze governments, the private sector and civil society to help to lift millions of people out of poverty, protect the planet and achieve shared prosperity and dignity for all." So no matter what the final negotiated text of the new goals end up looking like, one thing is indisputable. Eliminating corruption and its harmful impacts will be crucial to our future well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Seb, for reflecting on negative effects and also pointing out some of the directions we will be discussing in terms of responses. And I would like to close now this first round inviting Gonzalo. Gonzalo comes from Peru, which is a rich resource country which experiences many of the problems Mona reflected on, also with negative effects on vulnerable groups like women, and also you are a young student. So from this perspective, as part of the group of younger people, younger generations, how do you see the problem, and also in terms of the negative effects, but also which role can you play in order to give responses to this problem?
Hi to everybody, and thank you for having me in this panel. I think pretty much all our panelists have covered up the theoretical aspects and the definitions of how we're tackling corruption, and I hope you now get how important it is for development, and what it's not only about the financial aid or the money we give for the change we try to implement by policy. We also need to be aware that there is this underpinnings inside, at least how I see it in an agent basis. How the situation are also shaped by gender, and yes, but to your going back to your question, Arantxa, I think that it's important that young get engaged in the in both the political advocacy and whistleblowing, so to speak, of corruption. And not only because we see on the young the hope for change, but also because they are citizens as well. So they need to be integrated. So I don't think that it should be only concerned about the future hopes, but also what can you do now? Because the corruption, unfortunately, has a face, and there are people that should be liable for corruption. So we need to have also a legal system that is strong enough to prosecute these people and to get them to justice, because it's not only unethical. It might be in Peru, for example, the media treats every corruption as a scandal. So it's pretty much fun. In the media, everybody just gets upset, and it only lasts for 1 month or so. But what happened afterwards? That's the question. I mean, how are we aware how these people that are the culprits of corruption, they are guilty of getting money, or not only trafficking with influences as well? How are they faring in the legal system of Peru, in my case? And I guess that's very important, that we need to empower this new generation, as well as the generations we have from now, to be aware that corruption is not only something to be very indignant. Obviously, as human beings, we have an ethical and moral background. We say corruption is not a good thing. It's affecting the poor the most. Is coped in the rational way. Is not optimal. We can say is you binding by getting secret behind the table sort of thing, so it's murky, but there is also the other side, and we need to see that corruption has to be more representation in the legal corpus of any. And just to sum up, there are many aspects of corruption we can handle, and to relate to my own experience, I guess it's also important, as most of the panelists are talking now, is both enterprises need to exercise this fight on corruption, or to be accountable for themselves as part of the social responsibility. It's not only building assets and getting health centers and or another environmental regulation. No, it's as well part, in my point of view, the social responsibility in general, to do it, the business, and especially when they come in partnership with local sources of native populations, for example. They become clear on their accounts or their own failures as well. So it's not only about, I guess, we tend to assess about money, but there is a good example that how building a bridge was actually totally a failure because of corruption. So you can see there was the money, there was the investment, everything was legal, but the quality of the bridge was not good enough. And how it frames on corruption? It frames on corruption because you get cheaper material, you get poor qualified workers to get jobs, so you get more money out of it, and you get this dirty profit, so to speak. But it's, I guess, not only also this, we get to see this image that become more social responsibility as well for the enterprise, or the quality of the product or the assets they're building. Yes, and now back referring to my experience, there is, I come from a state-funded university in Peru called San Antonio Abad, and this university gets the money from the gas that is next to, in the same region of Cusco. So we get a percentage of the total profits of the, it's not that form of taxes, but the taxes, they don't go to the government, they instead go to the university or go to the government, local government of the region I come from. So there is actually much money that's going into both the university and to the local government, and unfortunately we as young people are not able to assess where this money is going to, where is it going to be used. I mean, who's getting in charge of that money, because it's not the money of everybody. Despite that we are students and we can say we are part of the institution, we deserve to get better education, there is funding, we are getting money, but there's actually the question who's in charge of the money afterwards. We get the profits and how to develop that in that perspective. Only to, if we try to get the developing, for example, in the university, to build or to get more technology, to get better teachers and do scholarships, for example, for the poor students, we need to be aware first, in my opinion, that the students need to take part of the organism that's supposed to be accountable for that, not only the authorities of the university. And I guess this also works on the national level, when you see that it's citizens themselves, NGOs, or as a third party, international third parties as UNDP, that try to press the governments or the institutions or the firms to be more clear when in accountability, and how this is important because it's affecting the poor people. In a state-funded university, you find people that come from the poorest backgrounds of society, and it can be say that despite they have money, I mean, out of the sudden, they still have to deal with these issues of corruption, and that's I guess I rounded up. And
I would like to invite our commentator from the audience.
So I think it would be really great if you reflect and react to this first round of comments and remarks, and also maybe highlight some of the critical questions you would like to have answered regarding the problem of corruption and tax avoidance from your perspective as a student, as someone working on environmental issues, where there are many negative effects of corruption and tax avoidance. So please, Sofia.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. It's a really interesting topic.
A point that I think it's very important to talk about is how normal people stop trusting the systems, because corruption is so embedded within these systems that at the end people just don't trust, and it's a way of living. Briberies is something that becomes normal. To get education, to get health services, it's something that you just don't even think about as a citizen anymore, because you think, well, that's how things work, because we don't trust in the system anymore. So I would like if some of you could speak or reflect a little bit more on how to, if these institutions that you represent have any mechanisms of ideas of engaging regular people in getting back the trust, and how that would affect like both ways, like normal people stop believing that corruption is normal and bribes and all these kind of things, and how would be what are your advice, opinions, or examples of how to engage regular people and also youth related to social media, for example? How can we engage more? Just in recent years, we've seen how a lot of young people have mobilized through media, and social movements have been created using these tools. But how to make that a permanent state, that people and young people is engaged in anti-corruption practices. And because I'm also working with environmental issues, like I was studying something in Guatemala, I would like to know more about what you, Mona, said about the transparency mechanisms that you have with extractive industries. Because, for example, in Guatemala, it's legal that companies just pay 1 or 2%. So it's in the system is already established is legal. It's nothing that that's how the system is created. How you can create accountability and how you can influence to make these laws being changed. So then the tax revenues actually go to the country and not to the companies that are investing, because the resources are from the people. And also how to create some trust. Going back to the trust topic, how to make people also aware of paying taxes, because in Guatemala, for example, is a very low revenue from taxes, and also like personal taxes, because people don't want to pay them. They know they're not going to go to anything beneficial for them, no health, no education. So how, if you could point out some mechanisms.
Thank you, Sofia.
Well, I will turn now the questions, and I know they are difficult questions, to the panel. I think it's one of the main messages of today's campaign, actually, is that people should give a response and realize that corruption is not the regular way we do things here, but that we can actually avoid this trap. So what are some of these responses? How we restore trust in political institutions, in the private sector, how we can engage citizens, how we can people make them aware of the importance of paying taxes and contributing to the delivery of services in different ways. Any responses based on the experience of your work in different organizations?
I see your point clearly. I think you're very engaged with the young people getting into the media, but I say corruption, it shouldn't be stopped just in a hashtag, in a Facebook page. Okay, we're outraged, we're gonna become a mob, or cyber mob got into the internet and start trolling and everything. I see your point. People get outraged. I mean, if you see that your money, you are poor, and your money that's supposed to be to social welfare is taken out by a rich guy in a suit and flying to Switzerland, for example, it's outraging. I mean, who wouldn't be? But the point is, we need to see there's this rhetoric that is circular. And the point, if you say the government is inefficient and the government is not doing enough to get the taxes from the richest companies, so you cannot trust neither the government, neither the private sector. So the people are left behind. In a democracy, it's just a split. You split the people from the countries, you split the people from the businesses. So there's a distrust, and you pretty much are trying to create conflict. It's a source of conflict where the people try to stay by the law, but they don't have the means because they feel abandoned by the legal system that is supposed to oversee who are the culprits of this corruption act. So I like to remind that corruption has a face. I mean, it's a human phenomenon. So it's not only a thing that happens. It might be also the system, but also we need to be accountable for ourselves. There's a legal system, and unfortunately, we have laws, and as you say, in Guatemala and every southern country that is affected by corruption, everybody has laws against corruption. We have many institutional instruments that are in charge. But what is this split? How come that the people cannot trust this government? And you said you don't trust the government because the government is giving away taxes. So you can go on like forever, I guess.
But I think that how can we create trust? It's a hard thing because trust always needs to be gained. And in order to do that, companies have to produce information that civil society is asking for. Government has to produce information civil society is asking for. So we have to keep the companies and the governments accountable. And unless they are accountable, it's hard to trust them. So it's possible to develop argumentation based on that. Like, we won't vote for you if you don't produce this information. And to also show the discrepancy between, well, it would be a difference in Guatemala and Norway, but for example in Norway that argument would be more valid, that we are paying between 30 or 40% tax. Why is that company paying so little tax? So depending on different country contexts, you need to find the right entry point into there. But I think it's important also to look at, it's hard to demand that ordinary citizens are going to be paying tax and saying, let's start there in order to mobilize capital. If a person comes to a woman in Zambia owning a small store selling chewing gums and potato chips and saying, pay the tax, and she doesn't know who the man is or where the money's going, what is happening, it's a hard place to start. So if a government is more willing to discuss elementary things when it comes to the issue we are working on, extractive industry, we need to discuss two things. Which values are created, where, how, and when, so we can do the accounting. And the second question is, so how is it then shifted and moved in order to know what can be distributed at all, in order to see the difference between countries and what can be distributed within one country. So I think that you need to start with the government, I think. And I think also to engage youth on social media. I think it's hard, the younger you are, probably the better you are to answer that question. We have been working when we have capacity building programs to try to introduce how is it possible to engage in social media and how to keep individual politicians responsible and just keep on doing the same thing. But you also need the knowledge to match it. You need to know how to operationalize it and not just the normative, although both strands are needed in order to mobilize and engage. And you had a point on environmental issues. I think also the argumentation on the financial transparency area, which we are working mostly on, it might be underused as arguments for protecting the environment and to create red no-go zones. Because when you don't know what is extracted, you don't know how much was there in the beginning of a year, you don't know how much is there in the end of the year, you do not know how the profit is shifted before any number is presented for taxation. How do you know that is worth it in relation to the environmental cost? Because it's one of the most dangerous industries. It has a high environmental cost to take out. So I think it's possible to use those arguments also in environmental work to protect biodiversity and forests.
I would like to lift this one level up too, and because at the UN we pass resolutions, we pass declarations, we pass conventions, and
different member states are prone to look good to the international society and willingly sign on to declarations and resolutions, but there's a lack of transparency in the implementation once they get back home. And I think that's one of the problems, that there's a lack of accountability to what you sign on to. So part of what we need more to handle this is, I mean, first of all, we need a strong civil society that can actually speak out. But we also need to build institutions, access to justice. We need to strengthen the judicial systems in this. But we also need to look at different countries' financial systems, how they spend their money, how they spend their budgets. It's also become very clear now after the global financial crisis, where the World Bank and others also have enforced austerity measures on countries. And that again has affected public services, which again lifts corruption. So I think these are some of the questions we need to ask too.
You know, the more I think about this, I see that one of the conundrums we have with trying to tackle anti-corruption is sometimes we're trying to address a complex question in the same manner that we would build a bridge. And it's trying to have a technical fix on a problem that is not amenable to a technical fix. It requires looking at it in a much more institutional and political economy way. And you know, in simple words, it's, you know, we're dealing with people's attitudes and behavioral change. So it's a very different ballgame. And therefore we have to understand what are the incentives in the society that make people act a certain way and behave a certain way, and not another way that we want them to. So, you know, you've got, first of all, I think it's important that people, ordinary citizens, say corruption is unacceptable, not part and parcel of our life. If you say that's the way it is, then there is nothing that really, because the pressure has to come from somewhere. I don't think people who are benefiting from corruption are going to say willingly, I think this is a bad thing, we have to self-police ourselves. They will do so only if there is pressure, and we're seeing that, and that's coming out when people are en masse, whether it's social media or other ways. Corruption has now become much more acceptable the talk about corruption and that corruption is a bad thing has become much more acceptable. You pick up any newspaper, it's going to be on the front page or the second page. It doesn't matter what country you're from. I mean, I've traveled to many countries, you pick up the paper, there is a piece on corruption. Now, we have to also realize that oftentimes corruption is also used as a political tool to silence opposition. So there's a bunch of people who are corrupt. The sitting government may not like them. Let's throw them in jail. Fine, we'll pick these people, they're corrupt because they don't agree with our views, so we'll put them aside. So we have to also be careful when we see that corruption is being stamped out. Why is it being stamped out? Are they looking at, you have to understand the underpinnings. So I think it's very important to know and acknowledge that, for instance, also when corruption is happening at the lower levels, we're also looking at salary levels of civil service, which are exceedingly low in many countries. And for many of them, I'm not justifying it at all. I'm simply saying it's a coping mechanism for many who say, well, I can't survive. I'm just, a civil servant. I am part of the society where corruption exists, so I have to make ends meet. Now, it's not, clearly if you want to increase salaries, you have to do it from someplace, and you need to do it from the tax base. If you don't have a tax base, you can't increase the salaries. So it's almost a vicious circle that needs to be broken, and that goes back to trust, because if you don't trust the system, you're not going to pay your taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, you're not going to generate the revenue to be able to provide those services. So I don't really have a convincing answer on how to break this, apart from the fact that at some point there has to be within the society, there has to be a clear message saying, we don't accept that this is a normal part of our daily lives.
And if that happens, it becomes something that gets much more bigger. Parliament takes it on, other parties, private sector also, they cannot hide as much. And especially with laws such as access to information laws, we've seen that in many countries, access to information law, a simple access to information law has a multiplier effect. Because that means as a citizen, you can access data, records, which in many Western countries is taken for granted. In many other countries you cannot. You just don't know how the information, so you need that information. I want to make a quick point about young people and what some examples of what we have been doing more with young people. For instance, in Thailand there is a 6,000 strong youth anti-corruption youth network, and these are not just young people who Facebook like or tweet. They do that too, but they have set up a Refuse to Be Corrupt cafe, which is a social venture. Together with the private sector, where young people come together in these cafes where, of course, there's good coffee and there's business to be made, but at the same time they strategize together on how to address issues of corruption in their local district or the local councils or wherever. So, and it's a sort of growing movement, and it needs that to be sustained. In Kosovo, for instance, we also have UNDP is working to support investigative journalism. Many of these are young people, and there isn't a culture of investigative journalism, so you don't report corruption because you'll get into trouble. So you also have to know how to do investigative journalism, so you are able to uncover corruption, but you don't go overboard and get too clamped down by the authorities. And these are just two examples, and as I said, for UNDP, corruption has to be, we are interested at so many different levels, because it cannot be just, I mean, clearly tax avoidance is an important part of it, but so is looking at public sector reforms, looking at salary scale, looking at performance, looking at integrity, ethics,
and also the entire justice and legal sector, and parliament, of course, working with parliaments, because they're the ones that have oversight, supposed to have oversight on the affairs of the state.
It's also been talked about petty corruption, what regular people experience in order just to make their daily lives function in a society that is very corrupt. But what we're focusing on in our network is more the large-scale corruption and tax avoidance, which is so huge that it affects investments in institutions, it affects investments in health, in education, so that there is less and less money for people to be knowledgeable about what's going on, about health, to keep fighting, or to and obviously women are mostly affected, but we can also see we need to address this at a systemic level as well. So we were asked to have some questions to the other panelists. I don't know if we got there yet, but I think that one interesting question is that we know that the UN conventions are important. So in UN Convention on Corruption, it's very important. It's possible to refer to that, and it's possible, for example, investors to screen and to take that instrument into consideration. And I think that as a possible post-2015, we could perhaps push more for a possible convention on transparency in financial matters against closed structures, such as secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens, which will remove the necessary secrecy in order to stash away cash from corruption. So, for example, the family member Isabel dos Santos is the richest woman in Africa. She's a daughter of Eduardo dos Santos, and it's not seen as a coincidence that she was called the richest woman in Africa. The point was, where did she get the money from, and how come she got so rich, and how come the citizens are so poor? So I think those are important questions to ask also.
Have we been more effective in communicating the negative effects of corruption than the challenges that implementing effective solutions have? And how can we revert this and communicate more clearly that we have many challenges ahead of us, and how different actors can contribute to solve those challenges?
I'd like to look at the broader picture, because if you take the gendered effect into this, and also in access to justice, in access to economic rights. I mean, there was recently large research and a report done by, among others, the World Bank, where they went in and looked at 142 economies of the world, and in 138 of those economies there was at least one discriminatory factor where women had less economic empowerment than men. And that was everything from having their own passport to opening a bank account to citizenship to a number of other issues. And these, again, lead to women being more prone to being the victims of corruption. So I think we also have to start with some other instruments than just looking very narrowly at corruption. We have to look at the whole picture. And if we're going to do something, and also if we want to have more women into parliament, then we have to do something about the party system, about the electoral systems, not only have women in quotas. So, I mean, this kind of is a little on the side, but it's still very relevant. And the way we've been working up until now, looking at issues connected to gender equality, has been looking at women as a vulnerable group. I usually say that, you know, using a football analogy, you'll never win the game if half of your team is on the bench. So we have to start thinking totally different by not looking at women as a vulnerable group, but looking at women as actors of change, and much more actively also including the whole population to make changes. Giving also women the possibilities and the information they need to be whistleblowers and to be the ones who are part of the movement in a totally different way, because this has, to a great extent, as I was saying when I started off, you know, women are not corrupt because it's all male systems. Now, I don't want to include women to be more corrupt, but I want to include them to break down some of the systems that we have.
I think, as Jan said, press has to come from somewhere. So it may come from women, it may come from the youth, from civil society organizations. Donors have also a role to play. Can we reflect a little bit before opening up for further discussion on the role of the different actors?
Yes, I probably apologize to him because I was a bit pessimistic about the role of the youth and how many are engaging actively to change the state of things that most of them perceive as corrupt. But as UNDP has a huge role in getting both the two levels, at the institutional level, at the agency level, of corruption and dealing with ethic morals as well as tax avoidance. Both are the same spectrum of corruption, so it's a very huge issue. It only changed, but pressure from the population and not seeing corruption as being part of the business, not getting into that. But I guess that we also, as I've been talking, that and not only is the question of agency, that as one of my other panelists referred, that it can make your life easier to pay one coin or an extra $1 for one service. It might be a huge difference, especially if you're for a poor country, you're getting welfare, so you don't even have the money. So, but in another context, in another social sphere, it cannot be such a huge difference. So it gets invisible, the phenomenon. The media is supposed to reflect on not into the small scale corruption, but the tax avoidance and flight of capital, many corruption issues that got unsolved. But the media is as well subject to corruption itself. What would happen if in Peru, for example, we have a media that's pretty much owned by one single family? So it's not plural. So you have no voice, and actually in the media to say these families or these medias get or these enterprises getting away with too much taxation because they are pro investments, and they think that we should lower more and more the taxes because there is this pressure to globalize ourselves, and we need to open up the markets, and the lower they get the taxes, the better. And they see the tax avoidance, it might be royal grace, for example. You pardon that person or that institution or that enterprise to get away with the tax the enterprise is supposed to pay to the government, and that's promoting somehow investment. You don't get the opportunity to challenge that view, especially in the media. Now it's so polarized. And I agree very much with the idea that it's important to implement civil participation at the grassroots level, as it is as well shaped by gender itself. So it's not always participation in a neutral ground, but as well it has differences. So how do we assess that? This level of participation needs to be done, I guess, in coordination with the states, and I say that we were referring to this negative, ambitious circle of inefficient in the government leading to tax havens, and tax havens getting the most out of the government that's weak and inefficient. So I guess this synergy can work upwards. We get a stronger government, and businesses can comply to further regulation and get more quality services and processes as well. So it's not only downwards. We can always see that this perspective can both work in synergy with both government and private sector. I mean, how would you?
I just want to reinforce a point Gro made just a short while ago, and that is about looking at of course, the link between gender and corruption, and not seeing women as the vulnerable, but as agents of change. And I mean, I think if I look back into the work of the Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus, over 2 decades ago, I think he figured it out pretty early on that women were much more bankable than men. In fact, the vast majority of his clients were women, and the repayment rate was 98%, pretty respectable. I mean, again, and although Gro does say that the findings still are inconclusive, I think there is considerable evidence to suggest that if you put more responsibility in terms of managing budgets in the hands of women, then you are likely to get a better response or a result than what is the status quo. And I think we often look at how many women there are in political office, and whether as heads of state or in parliament, but I think probably we need to also equally look at how many women there are in government administration. So whether it's at the public level or at the local level, I would suspect that there are far fewer. And therefore, that's where the budget decisions often get made. That's where a lot of corruption and seepage takes place. So one way would be to, I would argue, to have many more women put in those positions, and then we can have a discussion and see whether it has indeed made a difference. I mean, I remember a few years ago in La Paz, Bolivia, I forget if it was the mayor or the governor, there was a decision made that they would replace or add many female police officers on the streets. So take away the traffic cops, who were notorious for being corrupt. And at the time, the result was the incidence of bribery fell as women were policing the streets. Now, I don't know, I haven't followed that further, but again, all I'm saying is I think that this isn't a silver bullet, but I certainly do believe that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that women can be, and women are, actors of change, if only they're given that opportunity in those positions currently occupied by men.
Well, what actually set me off was the Grameen Bank, because it's interesting, because there's now research coming out showing, research from Bangladesh just recently, showing that women who have microcredits are more prone to being victims of violence.
Because they're being pressured by their husbands, by their fathers, by their in-laws to give that money to them instead of investing it in their businesses. So there's an upside and there's a downside. And then just to add on to this, I think one of the huge problems we have when looking at the gendered aspect here, both on finance and on corruption, is that when we, in development and in also financing for development, when we talk about women, we talk about microfinance, we talk about microcredits, we talk about everything's micro. We have to lift the women out of the micro and into the macro. And I think that's the only thing you have to do to make changes. We have to stop peddling the small change in our pockets to the women and actually lift them up where they should be, alongside and into the big financial structures. And I think that's also the only way you're going to make the changes, where women actually get into being the one who sits in ministries and elsewhere managing the budgets. As of today, most of them aren't even in there because there's no structures to recruit them in.
Well, we have a female prime minister in Norway and a female finance minister in Norway, and they haven't been much looking at these aspects still, so we have a job to do there, even though they are good examples internationally of having women on the top. We need to, the structural issues here are so deep and so grounded in a financial system that we need to address the secrecy mechanism at a systemic level and show how this impacts all societies, including our own, on a competitive level of any national companies, meeting companies who don't pay tax, no matter which country. Some countries are just harmed so much more.
My name is Knut Gjelleseth. I work in the Norwegian RORG network, and we work with public information and public education about development issues. We have, we try to assess how to approach these things in a pedagogical way, and I have a question perhaps mostly to Mona and the representative from the UNDP, but also to the others if you have a comment. To me, it seems like there are two ends of this scale. You have what is called the petty corruption, paying some bills to get the services you shall have at the hospital. And then you have the completely other end, the multinational corporations doing tax avoidance. And to me that seems like a very, very big field to wrap into one pedagogical package. It seems to me like it's not going to float very easily in communication work. It also seems to me like that the biggest end, the largest amounts, they rest upon technically legal actions. At least they claim to be legal actions. Typically they're not really legal, but they claim to be illegal. While everyone knows that petty corruption is obviously illegal. That is just simply illegal. And in this picture, the corruption chain seems to me to be a difficult metaphor to use. I would assume, I would think, and I would like a reflection from the panel on this, that the petty corruption is just simply very human. It's something that must be fought and fought continuously against in all societies. But it's like violence, you can't eradicate violence. You need the police standing as a continuous force. To me, that seems like something that is mainly culturally based and must be fought against as a continuous struggle that just is a good thing in all societies. While the largest amounts, the big tax avoidance, big tax frauds, rests upon something else, and that is more aligned with the metaphor of the chain, and that you can actually snap, and once you snap it, the chain is broken and information flows out, and you can use that. So to me it seems like two fundamentally different things that needs fundamentally different pedagogical approaches when we talk to public about them. But I might be wrong, so I'd like a comment on it.
Yes, we tried to, we were so lucky that UNDP and Gert approached us on a different seminar we had on the industry of tax avoidance, 21st November, and see what can we do to mark this day. And the UN is a big organization representing over 190 governments all over the world, so they had already their material. So on on a metaphor chain. We try to incorporate with that, but to include the discussion of tax avoidance in the actual discussion, so that it was a material and short time. When it comes to our own work and trying to make something more possible to grasp, obviously we're very, very few, and we try to do a lot and all of that, but we do try to present the heavy stuff in larger reports, and we try to make that into 4 pages briefings to make it short, which we use as material in our training programs. And we also use people to illustrate a certain problem. I could have shown it here today, but I don't think we have any communication material with us today. But we then try to develop a metaphor, an idea of how we see this problematic issue, how we see this these problems and how they're linked together. So that is one way we're working at it. And also, the thing with what is illegal and what is illegal, it's also a matter of, as we have discussed many times, and I'm sure you're very aware of it, that it's hard to say what is what, exactly because of the secrecy. And I think it's important to talk about that. There are mechanisms that are quite easy to introduce if we are willing to talk about them and if we are willing to use them. Because in the debates we have seen that there are a variety of initiatives. Those initiatives will produce different types of information that will deal with different types of problems. And in a long, long process, as with the country-by-country reporting, we've seen that the responsible ministries have introduced less efficient versions of what will actually work. So the policy mechanisms that actually will do what it says on the tin and target and be directed and low cost, because we're using accounting information already available in the companies, which is the document on top of their desk which they need to use in order to structure their companies across countries. They're not willing to use that. So we get through the use of different actors, both accounting companies and lawyer companies, helping to develop legislation which is less, which expose company less. So in order to challenge the companies and the governments, I think it's important to say that there are actually mechanisms that can do this in a low-cost, targeted, and effective way. The issue is, are they willing to take it into consideration and start using it? So right now we have a legislation in Norway, which the Minister of Finance said that she wanted to review after 3 years to see if it worked. But when we know in advance that if you do not require this set of information from all the countries, you leave out jurisdictions responsible for corruption and capital flight, offering that form of secrecy that is necessary in order to facilitate corruption and capital flight. And it's also not accounting figures, so it's arbitrary figures of unknown provenance. It's not possible to know where they're coming from, so why not use the accounting figures that are already there? And you have to show the cost side. Now, for example, the largest gold mine in Latin America, it makes no profit. It has huge losses. Why is that? It's because you can structure your costs. Companies love costs. So unless you get those 3 elements into the Norwegian law at this point, it's not. I do not see any logical issue or argument for waiting 3 years for evaluating it. So it's obviously there is resistance also in the bureaucracy here, where it's been a long, long process with rewriting terminology and formulations into making it less effective.
Yeah, maybe it's a very good question, and I mean, I'm lucky that Mona went first, so I had some time to think about this. But I think what I would say is that, firstly, corruption is corruption, whether it's $1 that is siphoned off or billions of dollars. And I would still argue that the chain metaphor is valid, because even in cases of petty corruption, it's still a chain. It isn't a single individual acting by themselves. Frequently what happens in those cases, even where we see it as one individual, they have bosses. And all along the chain, the corruption goes. So if somebody takes $1 off a poor woman for her to see her newborn, that dollar goes up the hospital administration and even further up. I mean, there is evidence to suggest that, so it's a chain that way. Similarly, it's a chain also at the other end of the spectrum, where there is, what is called grand corruption. But I think the challenge that we face is with petty corruption, and I don't even like this distinction that much, but with petty corruption,
you can easily identify the person on the other end, and therefore you can that individual or individuals, you can direct your anger, your legal litigation, whatever, at that end, and you can galvanize people around that. On the other end of the spectrum, and it is a tremendous loss. It's much in actual volume terms, it's much larger. So what Mona says, for instance, an example I can give is in Sierra Leone. If we look at illicit financial flows, it's 600% of their GDP. Think about that. That's staggering, especially a country that's now trying to deal with the outbreak of Ebola, and you have cases, and so you have that magnitude to deal with. Again, because it's going through, it's not one individual, it's several individuals in concert with many other companies who have subsidiaries. So it's a very messy web that if you have to deal with. For UNDP, it's not that we don't deal with these issues, but again, we have to recognize that we often deal with issues when our national partner invites us to. It's tricky because I don't think many of these companies or individuals would necessarily say to us, listen, we're amassing great sums of money, can you help us identify and track it? Unlikely to happen. But what we can do, and what we do often, is with the government counterparts, where they do recognize that it's a problem, that it's hurting their own coffers. In terms of communication, this individual who is asked for a small bribe, they don't necessarily see the effects of those large sums of money siphoned off, and for them it doesn't seem to matter, because that's large sums of money, it doesn't affect me. What affects me is this person who's asking me for $1 or a few cents. But on the contrary, that huge amount of money that's siphoned off does affect that individual, except that person cannot make that link that clearly, because as a result of that money going away, the government coffers don't get that revenue, which means that certain schools and bridges aren't getting built, and in turn that community and that individual does lose out. But again, it's much more difficult to communicate that message, as important as it is to the average individual, than to say, look, you're dealing with corruption every single day at every different point. So it's just to say, I think both corruption, grand and petty, are important to tackle. But I think clearly the issues Mona is dealing with, I think, is much more complicated, and it does require a lot more thinking and reflection from our end collectively.
Please, the other two people in the back, yes. So we can collect the comments and questions, and we will address them in the last 5 minutes.
Hello, my name is Gro. I come from Transparency International Norway. I would like to challenge the panel on one question, and that is, when we look at the definition of corruption, in TI at least, we say it's the abuse of power for private gain, which means that we are concerned with the principle, whether it's big or small, petty or grand corruption, illicit money flows, or facilitation payment. And I think in UNDP fashion, we would also recognize that we need to look at this in a holistic manner. We also think that's very important, and I think that's what we hear reflected. Nevertheless, sometimes we need to make some priorities in terms of getting some action done. So the challenge then is, what is it that a panelist would say is the single most important thing that we can do to make sure that corruption goes down? Because our measures shows that I think we have been very good at measuring corruption, but we haven't been able to actually say that corruption is going down. What is the single most important issue
My name is Eric Mungai from Nairobi, Kenya, and I work with the African Alliance of IMCs and currently on an exchange with the White Global here in Norway. So mine is more of a comment, and maybe you could reflect on this. I actually liked what Mr. Kazi said on this. Actually, corruption is quite a complex issue, and it can be looked at from many perspectives and angles. But I would also like to say, I'd rather like to say in this fight on corruption, I also think it's crucial to kill, or rather look at the issue from where it's starting from. And as he said, there is petty corruption and maybe the bigger corruption. But to me, I think that it's still a chain, as you said, and it's all connected. So it starts from somewhere. And I think this is where I come and say that the youth play a great role in this. Since it all starts from one being young, if you grow up in an area that is corruption infested, or rather if I can speak from an African context, because obviously they vary in different areas. This is the same person who grows up knowing that corruption is okay. And even if you change the systems in the government, if the young people are not with it and they grow knowing that this is how it goes and this is how we do, then even if you put them, I don't think it will work, because people who are being elected will still be corrupt. And yeah, so I think it's good, and it's attitude and change. So if you target the young people, and there's an issue on the definition of youth, but maybe let's say from around 10 to 25, because they're the fresh minds, and you can have a great influence on them and create a bigger civil society, because they will act as change agents and influence. As they grow, they affect so many people, and this can bring a bigger effect and maybe raise the standards. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to use these 5 minutes to maybe first get some comments from the panelists on the examples on women participation and women involvement in anti-corruption, and also a reflection on the role of the youth, particularly in countries with problems of systemic corruption. And then I think we can close with one quick statement from each of you, setting that priority that you would like to have addressed in the next year, until next Anti-Corruption Day 2015.
Yes, I try to be, I guess, not to be pigeonholed into the idea that the young, the youngest of the panel should be only talk about this. As you see, corruption is only a change that affects on to petty thief or to the greatest scale, and the bigger scale you get, the more away with the acts you do, because you build some kind of resilience, and you get away with that because you're dealing with a weak government, weak laws, you're too big to fail, so to speak. But I guess this sense of confidence, as we perceive it on the young people, from this perspective, it needs to be challenged as well in the legal ground. And I'm afraid I don't agree with Mona of just blaming institutions, blaming corporations, blaming Google, because behind Google there is a face. Who's going to jail of corruption? Who's whistleblowing these corruption acts? Because we get through, I guess, we should remember that corporations are concepts. How can we blame a concept? I mean, it's a human who's doing the money, who's getting profit out of it. It's a very human decision-making thing. So I think that we can miss. I don't say the approach we're taking is completely wrong or this absurd, but I guess we miss in trying to reverse the situation of corruption from in the legal ground, at least, to when we speak of corporations and getting sued or suing corporations just per se as an abstract concept. We see that is it CEOs who are in charge, as he say, I guess there are bosses. There are people always who are accountable for that acts, and we should always. I guess Mona is doing an excellent job in getting the right numbers for the institutions, and they should be more transparent. And that's very important, but I say that's only the first step. If we want to break the corruption change, it's not only the thing we always get to see what's a follow-up of that case. We got the change, there is corruption, as some member of the audience said, but what about the change? I mean, who's getting punished, who's getting in jail to avoid this is not going to happen. All the countries have legislations against corruption because we know corruption is systemic and is damaging to development. It must undo many works. We try to especially accomplished in the South, in the global South. But unfortunately, we see that we got the ciphers, we got the numbers. We, especially in Peru or in Kenya as well as some example, we got. But who are the people to blame of corruption? It's just to get the names. I guess the press is used for that, but the press is not always reliable. So the situation gets more complex if you want to bring participation, because as it's been raised to the point that corruption can be used as a political tool as well. So when you name your enemy as corrupt and you take it out of the political arena because that's convenient, it's still missing that link that it's important to get corruption and to human perspectives. A human act and needs to be punished by law, not only by indignation or outrage. I think that's okay. It's to be outraged. It's very human reaction as well. But it shouldn't only stop into that. It get more into the legal and getting actually people punished, or at least somehow to reflect or repair the damage they have done by acting or taking something that is probably damaging to the bigger society, in the bigger scale. So.
Any other comment from the panel before we go in this final round of identifying our priorities for the year ahead?
It could be interesting to just come with a comment on the individuals, because that is a very, very interesting topic in bringing people to account. So when we know that those who are facilitating this secrecy, they are bankers, lawyers and accountants, and they are actively facilitating the advice and the legal advices in order to make this possible. So the chain is not one single chain. The chain can be seen as a chain of papers where each paper would constitute a legal contract, and each one of those papers in itself would be considered as legal. But when you stash that into a huge round, you're starting to create a form. And when you create such a form within, for example, a time frame of 2 minutes, and you then push all the information through a tax haven, it's completely impossible to know who did what. Companies, they diversify their legal advice, their accounting advice. The 4 largest accounting companies, they have over 600,000 advisors all over the world. And also with the legal advice, they diversify their legal advice so that nobody will ever know what another legal advice may give, so that they can see the whole picture of what they themselves are doing. In addition to that, you have the complex issues of legal protection of information, so to speak. So a lawyer doesn't even have to say what he's been a part of because they have legal protection. So I think this is a huge puzzle, and we know also from court cases that it's extremely difficult to bring individuals to account. We tried that in the biggest Norwegian tax fraud case recently, where both of the people that was suspected and which was tested in the court case went free. So I think that's the huge problem with this. There's no single human that is possible to hold accountable, and a court system, it can't really easily bring to court 50 or 200 lawyers. It's nearly impossible. So I think this is one of the big difficult issues with these large-scale revenue streams we're talking about. But obviously, if it was possible to bring them to legal justice, that would be good. But I think that as per today, the legal system and the laws are inadequate to deal with the type of problems because they span across countries. Our legal system, economic system, they haven't developed fast enough in order to deal with many of the new problematic issues that we see today. And I think that might also be the reason why we have developed different concepts in order to try to talk about the problematic issues that we experience, such as corruption is abuse of power, but you can't really see where the power is or who gives instructions to who. Like in the Norwegian court case, which, to put it, very, not to give it justice, but say it very easily, the court case in Norway ruled that the mother company isn't responsible for what the daughter company does. That's what it's basically saying. So you can't really prove who did what, who gave which instruction to whom. And a company would have large financial muscles to deal with such court cases in any court system, and also in relation to environmental crimes. And it's hard to find who's responsible, and also to find the beneficial owner of any company, because they're often hidden. So I think that is a huge challenge, just to hold people to account, individuals.
Given this, and we have to close, so given this big puzzle, what would be your priority, Monas, for the year ahead of us, or for the tax avoidance, anti-corruption agenda in the extractive sector?
Well, I think each organization will say that, this is most important, but for PWYP Norway, it's most important with the extended country-by-country reporting, because that would demand that company give easily accessible, already existing information from their financial accounts, break it down per country for all countries, and put it in the notes for the accounts. It's very easy. The only thing that's necessary is for the politicians to demand that from the companies. In that way, you will make secrecy jurisdictions more irrelevant by demanding your own companies to produce that information, because any companies have to comply with the home country laws. So I think that will be one important step in order to visualize, to get the map, and just to see, okay, this is where we have built-up capital. That would be one instrument, but that instrument would make it possible to ask some questions and to see, are we okay with that? Or what should we do with that if the country wants to deal with that? So, but it's a huge problem. And I also would like to add that PWYP Norway also made an agreement with the UN Women in order to emphasize the gender aspects and how women are disproportionately harmed by lack of investments in development.
So growth was the priority for these gender and anti-corruption agendas, or for bringing them together.
Well, I mean, to also answer the question, what is the single most important issue to make corruption go down? I don't think there's a single most important issue, because I think you can't go in and just
pick out and think there's a quick fix somewhere. I think the same way you're talking about looking at this holistically, we have to look at fighting corruption holistically. And I think that's my challenge also in the year to come, that we have to look at this holistically, and we have to, I mean, the only thing it's going to, the only reason it's going to change is if you have somebody who's the head of the government who makes this a priority for the government, and then is accountable and institutionalizes it going down, so that it filters down through the system. And then, of course, you have to do a number of things. You have to look at salary levels and public service, so that public servants don't feel that they have to take that dollar from somebody to put in their pocket to actually survive themselves. It's a complex issue, and I think that we have far yet to go before we come to the end. And I just wanted to comment very briefly on saying that, what you were saying about Bolivia, it has also been replicated, for example, in Mexico City, where they've done the same. And I think that it's more than it's, again, a silver bullet or a quick fix. It's an indicator that we should have more room for women in all, different employments and different fields, to actually, say, as the World Bank says, employing women is smart economics, and it's also smart to combat corruption.
Thank you. Gonzalo?
Yes, I've been invited to this panel to bring the voice of the youth, but I'd like to generalize the point she last talked about, that women, or not only the young, but also women and the groups in the society that are misrepresented, or less represented in the bigger issues, so that a society needs to deal with, as corruption, and as Mona pointed out as a reply. And she said that corruption it's so big that it's not only an individual. You cannot bring 50 people to the court, and they don't have probably the same legal responsibility or liability. So it's a phenomenon, but we still need not to resign ourselves and say, okay, that's inefficient, that is supposed to happen because we are human beings, and somehow we're going to get corrupted, and the more we go upscale or downscale, the local or global level, there will still exist, but we still need to be, I guess the solution is in self-accountability at both institutional level, as is doing UNDP, and any institution should be more clear about its own self-accountability or self-transparency, because that's more feasible to do, and to work in parallel or with the legal system they have in the nation. So that, I guess that's important to have this internal but external aspect on corruption if we're going to make a real change, because either aspect that's too polarized and we try to get corruption just out and to cut it down just from either from little people that is paying its way or the big corporation, it's not going to be feasible, and because you have it's pretty much the position of who's to blame in corruption is indeterminate. And this self-accountability and self-reflection, I guess, is very important.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Yasser, final thought?
Thank you very much. Let me just, it's always difficult for me to, narrow down one priority. But I will try to do that, even though it goes against my normal way of approaching this.
But let me just touch upon the comment made by a colleague from Kenya. I think absolutely, if you look at the African continent, you have one of the youngest continents in terms of demographics. And there was a deliberate reason why I started my comments earlier with the anecdote with young people and children, because again, it really goes to show that the work on corruption really has to start at a very young age. And it's not to say that that's going to solve our problems, but the issue of dealing with ethics and integrity in curriculum at that level hasn't really been brought up. And I don't know to what degree it has been incorporated in many countries. Some countries maybe it's part and parcel and it's taken for granted, but in many other countries, this is something that could be taken on, and should be. In the case of Kenya, for instance, UNDP is working with Transparency International, with InfoNet Africa and the Office of the President to set up these youth integrity camps, whereby we working with people in their 20s in public service to look at some of these issues around ethics, in the public sector, in different ministries. But if I had to sort of point to one area, and it varies very much depending on which country UNDP is operating on, and it won't be the same. But I would say if I was in country X and I was given a finite budget and I was told pick one project you have to invest your money in on anti-corruption, I would say, to me, it would be working on access to information legislation or issues around access to information, because we've seen that has a great multiplier effect. What it would do is it opens up possibilities for civil society and others to actually then go, and legislation has to be not just about publishing information, but also have consequences if that information is withheld. So if you go to a government office and ask for information and they don't provide it, what then? There should be recourse. So that's where I would just simply say, it's not a silver bullet again, because we do work in a very comprehensive manner, but if I had a finite budget and I was told, Jamshed, you have to focus on one project and that's it, then that's the one I would pick.
Thank you. With these final thoughts, priorities, and wishes for the next year ahead of us, I would like to thank all of our panelists for their time and their commitment to participate today, for sharing their experiences, their ideas, their thoughts about how to say no to corruption. I would like to thank Publish What You Pay and UNDP for joining forces to organize this panel discussion today, and for inviting U4 to be part of this effort and this initiative as well. And especially I would like to thank you all for your participation, for coming here today, and I hope that you will take with you some important ideas and thoughts for reflection. Thank you very much.